Well, hello everybody online and hello everyone in person. This is the final event in the Case for English series. So we have an event on the case for the value of literature, the value of criticism, and this one is the value of the material. And these three events we're hoping will help to build the case for English at this difficult time. So yeah, I hope perhaps we'll have a few minutes at the end to kind of draw the threads together and relate the literary, critical and the material if we can. And so, yeah, really fantastic speakers today. We have Cynthia Johnston here, who is a senior lecturer in manuscript studies here at the IES, and her research is about medieval manuscripts and how their trade in the 20th century contributes to ideas of value. And Jill Partington is also a fellow in book history here, and her work explores modern and contemporary book cultures and the intersection of books and art. And she also works on book destruction, which we might talk about as kind of negatively defining value, perhaps. Laura Cleaver, on the screen here, is senior lecturer in manuscript study. Oh no, I think I made did I make a mistake when I introduced you? Yeah, because I reordered everything. Cynthia is a senior lecturer in history of the book. Yes.
It's all the same thing.
And she works on medieval manuscripts and the cultures of collections. Yes.
Yes.
From the 18th to 20th centuries. Okay, I'll swap you around. But we've already heard your description, Laura. Misattributed to Cynthia. You're senior lecturer in manuscript studies at the IES, and your research is about medieval manuscripts and their trade in the 20th century. And then finally, Bill Sherman here.
You forgot.
Oh, sorry, I'm all over. Sarah Pike here is Associate Research Fellow here and a postdoctoral research associate at Anglia Ruskin University, and she works on the history and reception of children's literature. And Bill is Sherman is director of the Warburg Institute, and he was previously director of research and collections at the V&A, and he published widely in the fields of book history and textual transmission, reading practices, and early modern literature.
That is me.
Yes. So welcome everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm trying to get my audience correctly now. So we're going to start with you, Cynthia.
Okay, thanks very much. So 13 years ago, I think in this very room, and I think actually Warwick was here, I convened a seminar called The Future Perfect of the Book. In 2010, there was a real anxiety about the future of the central object of the study of English, the codex form, in a world that had been suddenly destabilized by the ascendance of the digital. At this moment, we can see that the codex has survived and even thrived, I'd argue, in tandem with the increasing hybridity of the digital text. It seems a cruel irony that the success of the book as a hybrid form, and particularly the physical form of the codex, is shadowed by the decline of the study of our subject. So I'd like to suggest in 5 minutes that the material turn of English studies in the form of book history, that it can demonstrate both the power and the central importance of the discipline. It might be argued that book history emerged from a reaction against the deconstructionist criticism of the 1980s, particularly through the work of Roger Chartier in the 1990s. But I think we can see the focus on the material emerging even before that, with the rise of social history, with the work of, say, Asa Briggs, Social History of England, published in 1985. The focus of the material has followed strongly through social history and also through popular culture, with perhaps, I think, the most important example being Neil MacGregor's History of the World in 100 Objects, which was produced as a BBC podcast in 2010. Frank Trentman's Empire of Things in 2013 has led us on to an approach to decolonization using this template. For English studies, I think we have the power of the object in our hands to demonstrate the case for the study of English. The case for the crucial importance of the material object in the study of English has always seemed to me implicit in a single manuscript, long part of the British Library's Treasures Gallery. Sitting amongst a copy of the Magna Carta, the Lindisfarne Gospels, a Shakespeare First Folio, a Caxton Chaucer, and a Gutenberg Bible is the only surviving manuscript of Beowulf, which is, of course, singed around the edges. Only by serendipity did this manuscript, which also includes other Old English texts, escape the fire in Robert Cotton's library on 23rd October, 1731. So Beowulf has survived the death of the author, always, in that it was anonymous, a work probably of many authorial voices. It has thrived through its 1,000 years, particularly recently with retellings, not only as verse, but as novels, short stories, graphic novels, comics, music, and films and video games, as well as Claire's series, Art That Made Us, last autumn. But without that skein of materiality, that web of parchment and ink that caught the words, our loss would have been immeasurable. Beowulf is an example of the drama of textual survival, of a poem that tells us much about the past and the present through its text, but its multivalency through its physical presence tells many stories as well. The story of the text's narrow escape from oblivion is told by its crispy margins, but the physical book itself tells the stories of those who made it, who read it, who kept it, and those hands who it passed through with its marks of production, use, and dissemination. It's the drama of the physical object that's crucial for our future, for the future continuous, if you will, of our discipline. One thing is certain, that we will have been teaching Beowulf in the future by virtue of its physical insistence, its materiality implicit with layers of human experience. And I wanted to close with an anecdotal incident. Last night, I attended my first board meeting as part of a supervisory team overseeing the delivery of a 3-year NPO project for the Blackburn Museum and Art Gallery. The museum holds collections of many things: Victorian paintings, religious icons, Japanese prints, textiles, and ceramics. But one of its most important collections is the Ari Hart collection of rare books. We were discussing outreach agendas for the collections, and one of the Blackburn counselors, Martin Eden, surprised me by remembering an occasion 10 years ago up in Blackburn, where we took some of the books out of their cases to show to the counselors and Jack Straw, who was then the MP for Blackburn. And Martin said that seeing that book, which is a 13th century Italian missal, out of its case, to hear the turning of the pages, to see the glimmer of the gold, to see the vibrancy of the colors, was one of the most unforgettable experiences of his life. And to me, that sums up a large part of what we can do in the future perfect of English. Done.
Done.
Okay. So here's a little vignette from an undergraduate English seminar room in the early 90s, somewhere in the Midlands. It's a course on the British post-war novel, and Margaret Drabble's A Summer Birdcage has been assigned to the course. It's a story about female frustration bumping up against the limits of middle-class morality and expectations in the limbo between university and marriage. But nobody knows this, as nobody has read the book. The room is quiet until the discussion turns to the paperback cover, which we are all agreed is hideous. Why does it look like this? Who makes these decisions about a book's appearance and design? Is the author involved? We don't know, but older second-hand copies look quite different and present the novel in a contrasting light. One person has a battered jumble sale copy with some fascinating and rude marginal notes from a previous reader. There's even a rumour, partially confirmed by the lecturer, that the novel has only been assigned because the university bookshop has accidentally bought too many copies. Discussion is suddenly animated, but none of these themes, the material artifact of the book, its cover, production, publishing history, and sales, are on the agenda. We can't look at the outside, only the insides. The only time materiality is permitted onto the syllabus, in fact, is the week on cultural materialism, a special brand of literary theory in which you are suddenly permitted to talk about books rather than texts. Several decades and a material turn later, and here we are, English looks very different. Things have unmistakably shifted, and something called the material text has emerged as an object of study. Perhaps the discipline has expanded, or else it has found new zones of overlap with book history, whichever spatial metaphors you want to use to explain this shift. But my point is that when we think about the value of the material, it's important to note that it wasn't so long ago that it had very little value within English. It's rather a latecomer. It doesn't have quite the same footing as those earlier, more traditional fixtures of the discipline we've been talking about in previous sessions, criticism and literature. It's more of an interloper, shaking things up and rattling the china. It doesn't displace those other categories, maybe, but it does prompt rethinking and readjustment. There's a sometimes awkward fit, perhaps, between the literary text and the material book, but a useful one, even that it can reorient the discipline of English, placing its object of study in new lights and new contexts. So I'll make two claims for the value of thinking materially. The first is that it adds historical nuance, depth, and complexity to discussions of literature. Permitting the material book into the conversation allows us to see literature as something embodied and embedded, connected to a whole world of material things. Some of the most interesting work in English in recent years, for my money, has come from situating reading and the book in material culture, asking how we do things with books and what it is that we do. Thinking materially connects the book to a surrounding world of other media objects too. If it seems that the book in the 21st century has become something complex, hybrid, and multimedia, then the lesson from book history is that it always has been in various ways. It's been a messier, more dispersed object than the conventional notion of the codex would suggest. So we shouldn't be squeamish about the term media, or indeed media theory. Some of the most interesting work in English engages with this crossover to broaden our understanding and definitions of the book and reading. And this attention to the interrelations of media, material, and narrative, the ability to analyze nuances of meaning, register intention, to think critically about matters of textual sources, citation, mediation and remediation, is a special and valuable ability. In fact, it's perhaps the most valuable skill one can cultivate or teach right now. To use a recent and not very picturesque term, English teaches information literacy. I don't think we should be squeamish about that term either. It teaches it in a way that no other discipline can claim to. And this, as we all know, is something which is urgently needed, which brings me to my second claim, which sounds a little bit like a disaster movie pitch. There is more at stake here than the defense of the discipline. we find ourselves in a situation when forms of narrative are one of our biggest threats, in the form of disinformation, fake news, conspiracy, the blurring of fact and fiction. The ability to read carefully and critically with an attention to the medium and matter might be the only thing that can counter this threat. In other words, the most urgent questions have become literary ones, and ones that only English, rather than big data or science, has the tools to think about.
Thank you. Laura.
Great. Can you hear me okay? Brilliant. I think there will be some repetition over the various things that we're going to say, but I think that's no bad thing. So yeah, I had 4 points that I wanted to say in 5 minutes, many of which actually have been made by Jill, but perhaps with a slightly different emphasis. So the first thing that I should say is that I am an art historian. If you ask me what my disciplinary roots are, I say art history. I did a degree in art history. My first job was in an art history department where I was occasionally reprimanded for spending too much time talking to historians without ever really being accepted as one of them by the historians. But all of this then means that I am not particularly invested in the idea of saving a discipline for its own sake. I feel quite strongly that disciplines should exist to support the research that we want to do at this moment in time, not the other way round. Now, that said, the thing that has linked my various career phases is the book as an object. I started out as a medievalist, and the thing that has really interested me throughout all the different things that I've done has been the handmade book as evidence for engagement with a text by the people who made that book, and then subsequently by the people who kept that book, whether they were pulling it out of the cotton fire in the case of Beowulf, or just enabling it to stay on a shelf or in a cupboard somewhere such that it has survived and we can now study it. And I think people invest in books as objects in complex emotional ways that we could really benefit from better understanding. My mother worked in a library, and so I'm aware that there's a whole genre of jokes about people who go into libraries looking for a book for which they vaguely remember the story or the subject. They have no idea of the title, they have no idea of the author, but they know that it had a green cover. And I think that speaks to something about the way in which we do really resonate with the book as an object. The way in which we experience the story, the physical experience of that is important. And at the same time, and slightly in the light of some of the discussions that we had in the last session, I think it's really important not to fetishize the book as an object. The material that I work in shows us that stories and other kinds of material have circulated in pamphlets and on scraps, as well as orally, for centuries, whether we're talking about the Middle Ages or Dickens or short story writing in magazines throughout the 20th century. There's been a real range of formats, and we should be open to engaging with that, I think. Which takes me to the bigger point that I think the importance of this ecosystem, which again resonates with what we've already heard, is important. And we should therefore be open to engaging with wherever exciting storytelling is happening now, whether that's TikTok or video games or Jill's disaster movie. Now, if that is somewhere that our students are interested in, then that's something that we should be prepared on some level to engage with. At the same time, and as a sort of caveat and balance to that, I do think that disciplinary rigor is important. I know I sometimes tease my colleagues that they're all too well read, but one of the things that I really admire and enjoy about them is not only that great wealth of reading and experience that they've got, but all those critical skills for analysing literature that I don't have because I spent my time learning how to analyse art. And I think, therefore, we want to find a level playing field where we can respect one another's disciplinary expertise, but also we don't want to lose sight of the training that is provided through English and of the and we don't need to be afraid of saying, actually, it's hard. You need to put in the hours and put in the work to achieve an excellence in this area. So that was me, and I will shut up.
Okay, thanks everyone who's spoken so far. Another anecdote from me to start, I'm afraid. For about 3 years during my doctoral study, I travelled on the last Friday of every month to HMP ISIS, a young offenders institution in Plumstead, South London, to run a reading group with the young men who found themselves inside. We read widely across genre, if not form, novels that they would choose from the selection I toted there, or that they found browsing on the library shelves, or recalled from reading at school or at home when they were even younger than they were when I knew them. On one occasion, I pulled out a selection of copies of George Orwell's 1984. Picking up the Penguin Modern Classics edition from 2013, and you've probably seen it, it's the one with the iconic penguin orange bands at the top and bottom, but the title and the name of the author have been struck out by thick black bars as if censored. One of the boys compared it with the older editions on the table. "Is this the same book?" he asked me. The assembled group surveyed the various volumes spread out before them. "Yeah, it's the same author," someone pointed out, "and the same title. But it looks different." Then, relieved, a solution dawned. "It must be a remix, miss." "Yeah, that's it. They've remixed it." It's a startling paratextual misreading, jolting us out of any complacency that reading the material object of the book is something we can take for granted. There was no sense for this group of readers, for they were all readers, and this was a self-selecting book club, that the cover of a book and its content were in any way conceptually separable entities. Their interpretation doesn't fit a consumer framework. After all, these young men would be familiar with the foodstuff that changed its packaging, or the commercial brand that redesigned its logo. In lighting on the remix as the explanation for the concept of the edition, these readers posed good questions about media and about format and about the copy. Although they instinctively transposed it to the medium of music, they would have had no problem understanding the 12-inch record which played the same track as the MP3. What registered with them is the book, cover included, as an integrated art form. In their reading, the cover belongs to the book, much in the same way that album artwork belongs to the album. They assumed that if the outside of the book looked different, the inside must be correspondingly rearranged. In the conversations we've been having in this series so far, there's been an assumption that when we talk of criticism or literature or reading, we all understand to what we are referring. But in the prison reading group, I realised that we can't assume a shared interpretive framework, even for the physical book. The first point I want to make today is that in making the case for English, we are also making the case for books as material objects, which we have to be trained to understand in much the same way as we have to be trained in criticism or close reading. Louise Rosenblatt's reminder, as mentioned in the first session, that understanding a poem is in the transaction between the reader and the text. Well, it's also between reader and text in a more physical sense, between reader and book. It might be helpful to keep in mind these reading experiences that happen well outside the institution of the English department. Censorship and book banning, after all, are current pressing interventions into the material lives of books and of people. that continue to have repercussions outside the orbit of the undergraduate English degree. My second point is this. If we zoom out a bit and see how unevenly anything like an aesthetic education is accessible across society at large, we might also turn not only to the material objects of study, but to the structures that enable that study. The problem, I think, with the defence of the discipline is that there isn't one. Not that there isn't a defence, there are many, as we've heard throughout this series so far, but that there's no one disciplinary entity called English. Depending on where you look, or to put it even more bluntly, depending on the policies and resources of your institution and your relative level of power within it, literary studies is dying, facing down its biggest challenge yet, weathering a cyclical crisis which is built in, like capitalism's boom and bust, proliferating in multiple fields outside of the English department, and thriving all at the same time. In addition, there's a strange reluctance, as I see it, to acknowledge that our reflections and approaches, our diagnoses and prescriptions on the state and health of the discipline, are made and remade by differing conditions of professionalisation, precarity, status, age, gender, race, class, and means of access. They make it almost meaningless to speak of what criticism is, or what English is, or what the discipline needs as a whole in 2023. And this is another way that the material comes into play, the material circumstances of our intellectual, scholarly, and working lives. I can tell you from personal experience that nothing causes you to reflect on the conditions in which we work, more than another dispiriting login to a journal site or repository using one set of several temporary credentials, only to be told yet again that your institution does not allow access to this content. I don't have a simple answer to the complicated questions that this series has been raising. What I am sure about is that there must be disciplinary space for the bodily and the haptic, considerations of labour and positionality, for collectivity and collaboration, the preoccupations of book history in a way. That all of this is practical, structural, material, and that without these, there is no practice, method, or discipline worth defending. We heard in the first session about critical subjectivity, almost as something to be rehabilitated. In Teaching to Transgress, Bell Hooks reminds us not to teach as though only the mind is present and not the body. I am as much of a material being as my students and my objects of study. As I read, I shape these books just as they shape me. In making the case for what the matter is with English and why it matters, we can't ignore the matter of it.
Now, Bill.
Minute. Screen. That doesn't matter. I know what I look like. I'm really happy to be part of this panel and dreaded going last because, of course, all these brilliant people have said everything already, and it's fantastic to hear what they have to say. I endorse all of the assertions and questions and hope we can discuss them a bit more. I also felt a bit like Laura that I'm probably not best placed to defend English because I am not a professor of English. I'm a professor now of cultural history in an institution associated with the history of the image. So it's a slightly strange position, but having said that, I was an English professor for, I think, 22 years and have studied the material history of books and readers for, I think now, probably 35. So maybe that gives me enough purchase on the subject. And really, I wanted to just do my own version of the time travel and anecdotal history that everybody has been offering. And observe almost exactly what Cynthia observed in 2010, but in the 1980s, when I was trained in an English department in the face of really high theory in general, not just deconstruction. And in particular, as I found myself drawn to questions of interpretation, hermeneutics, reception, etc., a very, very established literature, or in fact, multiple literatures on how you approach that, from a historical and theoretical perspective, but almost no attention to materiality. And it just seemed counterintuitive from the first minute I read anything about reading, having done so with a book in my hand. So that, along with an absolute, almost hysterical panic about new technology, and I think especially of Sven Burgert's book, The Gutenberg Elegies, which I remember making a big, big impact on public discourse as well as disciplinary discourse at the time. Again, feeling, well, hang on, it's not as if we've never had change of technology around information before. And so it turned me with some confidence and even a sense of urgency to the study of reading as it could be retrieved from the physical objects that have come down to us through readers' hands in the past. And the idea of working on marginalia really had its moment in the late 80s, and I was very much part of that and very happy to have continued that interdiscipline ever since. We can talk more about marginalia and material marks in books after. It's something I think all of us have worked on in one way or another. But it's interesting to reflect now. I'm surprised that ChatGPT hasn't yet been mentioned today. There is another sort of hysterical panic going on. And again, you want to think, well, hang on a minute. You know, technology and information and words and images have gone hand in hand since the beginning. In some ways, there is nothing new about that. In other ways, maybe there is. So I think what I'm now feeling we need most, and where the training I received and the work I've done from within a book historical framework positions us well, is precisely to think about the relationship between physical books and digital resources in general. I think the vocabulary hasn't really changed since the British Library and Armadillo Systems developed the Turning the Pages interface now, what, 3 decades, at least 2 decades ago. And to be honest, I don't feel as if the tools themselves have changed very much. I think we're pretty much still working with the same gap, retrofitting. I think there are all kinds of issues around how we teach the things that everyone has said rightly that we need to be teaching within a digital environment. The tools have the potential to be extremely powerful, more than ever. And yet I don't think they're delivering those things for us or for the people who are turning to them and using them, either with panic or with glee. And I think one anecdote that really stood out from all of your anecdotes was the one about the counselor having the book taken out of the case, feeling it, and having that impact, that sensory impact, that manual experience. And it's a very resonant point, because at the moment at the Warburg Institute, where we're developing our first gallery as part of a complete renovation project, we're now thinking about what kinds of cases we need. And again, as it may have been lost in the various introductions, but I came to the Warburg from the Victoria and Albert Museum, where I was director of collections and had a lot of responsibility for and interest in the way we show things. And increasingly at that job, a growing frustration at showing things in a way that is different from the way those objects were designed to be used. And that's across the board. Some of them, paintings, tapestries, are less interactive perhaps than books, but certainly spoons, records, this is a weird thing showing in our national museums, these millions of objects that were used and made to be used as not in use. And I was really vexed by that, having written a book called Used Books, that we couldn't do that. And again, I think it's partly museology and it's partly technology. And so we are now thinking, as I said, about cases. And I'm in a interesting partnership with the National Art Library in Milan, the Biblioteca Bradense, which is part of the Pinacoteca Brera complex, and Sandro Goppian, who is perhaps the greatest case designer in the world, to create a new kind of case where you can actually give some interactive experience, some augmented, digitally mediated experience of the book without breaking the rules about conservation and handling, etc. And I think that's the area where I now feel maybe most urgent. I feel we need new approaches to the interface between the physical and the digital. I don't think we've really gone very far in that. So that's my own strange intervention. But maybe just to finish off, to return to this question of disciplinary position, I would just say, like I think all of us are saying in one way or another, I'm not sure it's English that we should be making a case for. I think it's the fact that the training that I got in that discipline and the work that I did under that banner has been absolutely the right training to become the director of collections in the largest collection of art and design in the world. And now a strange Anglo-German institution devoted to the afterlife of antiquity in visual form. And even to enter a prototype agreement about a new kind of display case. So at least from a career perspective, it has not worked out too badly, but I think it also is quite promising. So that's a cautious way of endorsing, I think, the thing that everybody else has already said so eloquently. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, there's some really rich opening contributions. Not a million thoughts, but please tell me yours.
So, just so struck by Bill's comments, and inquire further into sources for comments, and also the issue of the need for new approaches towards the interface. I was just wondering, generally, of all the panelists who spoke, all of you spoke so well about what you find useful in your material pasts as you focus on the digital. What is it you've learned about looking at things and touching things and listening to things that strikes you as being particularly useful now?
Can I just jump in right away quickly and just say very quickly, the history of interfaces, I would say, is what I found most useful. And it was particularly the work moving from the medieval manicule, as I called it, the pointing hand symbol, which is absolutely pervasive as a way of marking meaningful places in texts from the 13th to the 18th centuries, at a moment when Adobe and what was the web browser that I've now forgotten the name of that we all had to use, you know, the use of the Internet Explorer, that idea of the digit and the digital, and of thinking about the hand as that interface all the way through. It was such a clear thing to pursue. And yet, again, feeling like the hands I was seeing and the hands that had created those hands had so much more of a sophisticated approach to what an interface is than the tools that were on my desktop or laptop or whatever it was. And again, so it was both going back through the history of those things, but also reflecting deeply on the non-progressive nature of technology. And in fact, I feel almost across the board that technologies are at their best and richest right when they're invented. And they only get worse after that. And I think it's true of the book as well. That's a very radical, sorry, that took us somewhere else entirely. But anyone else want to jump in?
Well, I think my answer to that would be destruction, like the idea, thinking about the book as something that has a sort of obsolescence or an ephemerality built into it because it's a material object, and nothing makes you think about the distinction between the text as a sort of abstract, free-floating entity and the book than the kinds of things that Cynthia was talking about, books, pages with crispy edges, or, books that have fallen apart, or books that are, the kind of emergence of this weird object, the altered book, or the book sculpture in art, which is kind of completely defamiliarizes the book object and makes it seem very kind of visceral and physical, but also usually unreadable.
I think, yeah, I mean, I had it was a close shave with sort of unreadability, and that I was looking at another collection in Blackburn, in the Blackburn Public Library, and a collection created beginning of the 19th century, and nobody had looked at it for a very long time. They opened the storage areas, and there was this smell of mold, and the books were on the shelves, and they were covered with mold, and that sort of just happenstance intervention. Those books were sent to conservation, Lancashire Conservation, immediately. And it's that, that's a different kind of a physicality, and that's a different kind of, sort of chance encounter. And it struck me how, we can't forget the sort of, the essential physicality of stuff and how effervescent it can be.
No, so do you have anything to say about this? What past practices can give us?
Go on.
I just was thinking that one of the things that maybe isn't talked about enough, which the material, it's kind of one of the uses of the material, one of the things it gives us is an enormous amount of pleasure. I think whether that's the pleasure of reading the physical book or going to the archive and being able to examine the actual documents, whatever they may be, that's something that seems to attach to the material more than to the digital, I think, personally. But that kind of admission that there's something pleasurable and there's something that's affecting the body of the person who's reading or examining the material is just something I wanted to bring into the conversation, really. Yeah.
Laura?
I just wanted to really say that I think Sarah's point is absolutely brilliant, and that, as an art historian, that is something that when I used to do a lot of teaching, I used to spend a huge amount of time sort of saying to students, okay, on this slide, I have very carefully tried to show you that this book is tiny and this book is huge. But most of the time you don't bother doing that because there's only so much time and image resolution and everything else. But that experience, the difference between, the very intimate book that was designed to be carried around with you, but has probably survived because actually it was sat on a shelf. Because if you are carrying it around and reading it every day, then it's going to fall to pieces. And I remember being, again, anecdote time, but being in the British Library one day and the fire alarms went off, and I had a book that I could not physically lift on my own. And they just kind of looked at me and said, yeah, leave it, it's fine, off we go. And you think, okay, this is how bad things happen. But there are some books that famously are, all books essentially are portable, but some are famously much less so than others. And it's that sense of, again, the body, how books interact with the human body, I think is a really excellent point. So thank you, Sarah, for bringing that up.
And following on from that, I guess, thinking about discourses, for to make the case, from inside and outside the academy. And I guess, there's this idea of beauty and the magic of the book as object that you've mentioned, that Cynthia, that in a way that's quite a common discourse outside the academy, the beauty of the physical book and the magic of the physical book and touching it and so on. And also, of course, there's the monetary value of books in the book trade, and these are kind of external discourses, perhaps, and perhaps within the academy, there's more emphasis on like demystification, on looking at use and, trying to question some of that, like what could be called like fetishizing the sort of magic of the book and so on, or beauty, and questioning those qualities. So I'm wondering, how those different discourses can be brought together in a productive way.
We've also had a comment in the meeting chat from Leila, who says, I was wondering what the speakers think about the tension between physical books and a move towards digitization or ebooks, especially in a time when storage space and funding is limited in libraries of all kinds, for example. How do we ensure the perpetuation of material culture of books? And how do we reduce risk that only certain books of possibly elite value are retained?
Perhaps while we're gathering, are there any other questions? We can maybe take 3. Isabel.
As I was listening, it seemed that there's a wonderful case for the materiality of the book, particularly its physical pleasure. And the speakers seemed to feel that there was a kind of legion between the physical book and possibly the text that a lot of us think English studies is about, in this idealist way when we don't touch the material, which of course I disapprove of. But I wondered if one of the problems is to bring the text and close that legion. And I wondered if possibly thinking about not simply the typeface and presentation of a printed book, but possibly illustration is one of the modes in which the two things must come together. The materiality of the book and the text, they really cannot be made divisible. And to me, listening to people, one of the problems is that everything falls apart. There is a rich materiality around the physical nature of the book, and something abstract and idealist about what other bits of English studies there are.
We've had a few comments coming in the meeting chat. Do you want to have the speakers respond to those questions and then these ones?
Respond.
I can start on the sort of digital, which I think is a really interesting question. But I also think that we need to be, and this sort of bounces off something that Bill said earlier, that we need to be really critical about what is actually happening with digitization, as opposed to what we think probably is happening with digitization, because it's not exclusively the high quality elite material that is being digitized. There is some of that, but there are a whole raft of factors to do with ownership and copyright and trade that are driving this. So the public library in India has digitized tons and tons of late 19th and early 20th century material that I think no library in Britain would have considered worth digitizing and putting online. But it's there because they've got it, and it's driven by the fact that there is a rich industry in India in publishing that stuff in hard copy and selling it to people. So there's a whole kind of set of intersecting drivers here that are worth us just being aware of when we're thinking about this. I mean, I'm greedy. I want both, right? I want everything digitized so I can access it without having to leave the secure environment where I've got lots of lovely books that you can't see, but just to make me feel emotionally good about life. And I want to see the real thing and study it and understand what somebody's written on it and know it as a physical object. But we've got a whole raft of problems up to and including, the environmental collapse and how we're going to care for books when everything's underwater, that are going to shape all of this in ways that I think we can only guess at this point.
Well, I was just thinking about Isabel's question about how to sort of close the gap somehow. But I wonder if that one thing that we're talking about is English as it is taught, like the sort of practicality, the logistics of how you teach. And it would be wonderful to teach William Blake, for example. And here is an early edition, and look at the images and the text, and look at the subject of the book. But how do you do that in an undergraduate classroom with limited resources? So some things that we're talking about here are issues that have ramifications, or they're played out in quite practical ways, and so you kind of bump up against the economic and logistical reality of English as a discipline as it is taught, I suppose. The kinds of things that we're talking about, going to an archive, the joys of experiencing something in a very tactile way is not something that is available. So I mean, maybe this goes back to your point about how things are quite uneven. We shouldn't assume that there's a kind of even access to the kinds of things we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly goes to the point I was trying to make about we're all talking supposedly about the same thing: English literature, the text, the discipline, but actually wherever you are affects that in different ways. And certainly, of course, the Blake example is a good one. It would be wonderful to teach Blake like that, but if you're somewhere which doesn't have the resources, there's no way that you're going to be able to give your students that experience. And I think part of the reason I'm talking about the pleasure of the material and going to archives is because none of that was available to me as an undergraduate, or even on the agenda. I had absolutely no idea that book history existed until I was sort of halfway through my PhD. No idea that it was a thing at all, because we were only taught to think about the words on the page. You would never mention anything to do with the material, but with the consequence that book history feels to me like a very transgressive and exciting area, because I still can't believe that you're really allowed to think about the material. And I did my undergraduate degree in 2001 to 2004, so probably things have changed, but maybe they haven't changed that much, and certainly not at all institutions. And I think these ideas about the text as something abstract and free floating, and something which is not brought down into the object of the book, go exactly to Bill's comments about reading and thinking, why aren't you talking about the thing that I'm holding in my hand as I read you talking about reading, which is certainly the experience that you have when you read much theory about reading. illustration is a good way in, and I think if you think about covers and dust jackets, that's a way to make something very immediately material. I do think that it would be perfectly possible for illustration to be taught without thinking about the material, in that people would talk about reading the illustration, but they wouldn't necessarily have the skills or the capacity in the course or the background to be talking about the illustration in a more historical material way.
I think one thing that's fallen out of book culture in terms of how we teach is that, well, when I was studying English back in the 70s, oh God, everybody would buy their paperback book, and everyone had that book, and you actively participated in book culture because that was your copy. You wrote in it, you carried it, you spilled coffee on it, you made notes in it. And somehow, whether you liked that book or whether you rejected it, you still had that experience. Do you know what I mean? And so there is that sort of disconnect. I understand completely, I think, what you mean about there being there's an absence in our relationship with the physical book and the text.
And I've got to jump in here if that's okay. So I want to give you a few counter and pushbacks here that might help us think. First of all, I want to say this is a fabulous panel. The third in 3 fabulous panels. That's the first thing. I think what's really useful about today, and I've just said the verb, is that we've moved from case to use. And I think that's a very, very helpful way of thinking about it. The challenge, glory, and paradox of most disciplines, and I include most humanities disciplines, but perhaps all disciplines. The one we're talking about mostly here is English, but it reaches out and moves in, is that they're never singular, they're multiple. And we will always have to think about the material. I'm looking at Sarah here because I think she made a really important intervention about the materiality of the study of books, of the object of study in any case. So I think this is really great. I want to say something about Beowulf, however, because this is on the fetishizing thing. And this maybe speak to Isabel's point. Yes, I too love the physical book, of course. And we're a generation, it's a cross-generational experience, this. On the other hand, one of my other experiences that I love is reading my small iPad in the dark with black on white, which I now find as pleasurable at the end of a day as holding the paperback that is pretty much the same size. It's still to do with the hand. So I'm with you, Bill. I think we haven't moved much further on. So that's one way of thinking about it. And Beowulf, Beowulf nearly burnt. That's the whole story. It's a great teachable moment. In 1731, we nearly lost it. The point about that manuscript, of course, is that it doesn't tell you what's in it. Your point. It is a kind of middling, humdrum manuscript that nobody can identify the hand or where, the place. It's not one of the great deluxe productions of the early medieval period or of any period we can barely date it. It's the contents, Isabel's point, that are bound up with and bound into and woven into the text. The manuscript, and that's your point, Cynthia. It's the skein. The manuscript holds it, but so do the multiple editions, the digitization, and the story. So I think that's a false binary somehow that we've got going here. That there's free floating text and the material object. And I'd like those. I think we think too often about that because we're coming at it from different disciplinary perspectives. But go on.
Can I follow up as well? Just because I think you're right. And I think Blake is a super helpful person to have brought in, because it allows me to contradict myself and say that the Hypermedia Archive, Jerome again, was an absolute phenomenal breakthrough of exactly the kind of thing we're talking about, right? It shows fundamentally materiality, but it does so in a way that only digital technology could produce. So that's, for me, that's actually a really good example, and I should have acknowledged it. Not to mention, Isabella, his, I think, still incredibly helpful distinction between linguistic and bibliographical code. I think that pairing is, as both fundamental to meaning, is essential. So I wanted to follow up on that. But the last thing I wanted to just loop back on, having heard a lot of conversation about it, is it's true, and Jill, you and Adam and others have done such a great job of teasing out the poetics of the dialectic between destruction and preservation. I tried to do some of the same with my work on use of books, but I think there is a danger again, and it could be bound up with elite perceptions, etc., that the book itself is this unbelievably fragile, fleeting thing. They're incredibly hard to get rid of. And actually, the Warburg Institute, as a arc of a displaced collection, which has an open stack policy for 15th century books, it's great. It's the way that everybody can take these books in their hands and continue, hopefully not adding too many destructive things to them, but that's part of what it's all about, and they will live way beyond any of us. And I think that's true of most books, unless, we actively carve them up or make them into art, etc. But I do think it's important not to overplay the destruction card, because the whole field of book history has largely been driven by survival. Inherently shaped by survival. And I certainly wouldn't have any material to have written books about if every piece of marginalia destroyed the book it was in. So that's my other corrective.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So we've had a few comments in the chat. One from Elizabeth, who says, fantastic introductions, thank you all. What about the part of English that was historical bibliography, including history of printing, that was, she says, I think, so much motivated by wanting to understand what Shakespeare wrote and how that had been materialized? Can we apply like investigations to today's technologies that could empower comprehension and criticism? We've also had a question from Sasha, who says, this might be a bit of a vague question, but what is so different about interacting with an online or facsimile version of a text as opposed to an original? I think we would all agree that having access to the latter is important, but it's not always clear exactly why. And finally, we had one question from Somnath, apologies if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. I did see a raised hand, so if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, then please do so, otherwise I'll read it out from the chat. We'll just see if you're still there and want to ask the question yourself.
I raised my hand for a quick question. Which library in India has done this digitization work? You see, I am from India, so it interested me because we don't really have too many libraries doing that.
Yeah, good question. In my head, it's the Public Library of India or something. It's all in internet.
No, there's something called the National Library of India, which is located in my home city of Calcutta. So they might be the people doing it, because they have a seven-storied building full of 19th century newspaper articles. But
that could well be it. But it's fantastic, and it speaks to that sort of unexpected benefits of research that I'm sure whoever it is that made the decision that they would digitize these reams and reams of information did not think that me sitting on the other side of the world would find it useful. But it's hugely useful, particularly during lockdown. Sorry. But you had a question.
I think that was it.
There was another question in the chat.
My larger question was this. I mean, how do I communicate? You see, I teach in India, and I teach in a semi-urban area, And though I have an interest in material culture and I specialize in early modern literature and culture, I find it very difficult to communicate the materiality of the text to students. I mean, I can show them images of editions and so on and so forth, but I can tell them about personal experiences where I've handled things. But my broader question is, how do we get this across to students who are based in other countries and other continents without access to the kind of archives and libraries that you would have, say, sitting in London?
Thanks. And was there one more question?
That was
it.
No,
Yeah.
that was it. Yeah.
Thank you, Samna. Yeah, there's really great questions. I just wanted to add my own also, just to build on that first point about how to do the critical materially, because I suppose, because going back to what Joseph North said in the first session about criticism, like the material turn in the academy was, associated with depoliticization in some ways, but also interestingly, the material turn is reaction to the digital, and that's like a sort of could be an implicit critique of the digital. I remember my anecdote is teaching journalism to undergraduate creative writing students, and we went to a physical newspaper, and you could say this is a news story and this is a feature, and so because it's at the back, then we know it's sort of like fictionalized, and you can see it materially there. You can interpret text in that critical way using the material. So yeah, how can we use the material critically, both in that sort of interpretive work, but also to critique the digital, particularly when like open access, discourse of open access has kind of colonized the democratization and the progressive agenda in some ways. But anyway, sorry, I don't mean to.
Can I just
please do
add to that? I was also thinking of the category of the autodidact, the idea of the amateur, and I think that when we are talking about the material, it's also important to think about the repositories of the material. So where are we going to for the books that we are talking about? Where are we accessing the materials? I'm thinking of the library, for example. Thinking a lot about that area. And I was just reading, before I came here today, I was reading Alberto Manco's The Library at Night, and I would highly recommend that book to everyone. And he talks about the authority of the catalogue and how we are constantly coming up against that. So I think the trap that we often fall into is to think of the library as an inherently democratic space, but that there are limits to that as well. So that from that point of view, and I'm sticking my neck out here, perhaps the digitized would be the very randomness of the digitized world, the very vagrancy would perhaps, be potentially more democratic.
Okay, I got to jump in. Sorry, you hit one of my special bugbears. There's nothing random about the digital. It's highly programmed in a way which is much more limited and limiting.
Yeah.
So the point about, and I would say that's almost always true, not always, but almost always true. You can only go somewhere if someone has programmed a link or. But the point I would make is, the answer to your question is come to the Warburg Institute Library, because not only do we have a lot of physical books, but we have a structure which is unique, that delivers you to what you don't know how to look for and that no catalog could tell you. Now that's the point of a library structure. Whether you call it metadata or just architecture, it's what brings you to something to discover that you need but don't know how to find. And again, a search engine is almost the opposite. It only delivers either what you already know or what someone wants to sell to you.
I completely understand that.
Yeah, I know.
Part of me knows that, but I want to push the point.
Well, it's important.
I just wanted to, what I'm essentially trying to suggest is that we need to think more about not just the skilled or the trained reader, but also the processes of the autodidactic or the actual reader. I think that is essentially the point.
And to finish that is I need, as director of the Warburg Institute, to make it more open to more people who don't have the university degree that is the qualification to come in. So again, I'm totally up for that. And I think sharing more of this material is essential, because again, it doesn't take more than having, two paperback books with the same or different covers to get it. It really isn't, you don't have to see the first folio in order to understand the materiality. It's any text. I would say any text. Pretty much.
It is fun to see the first folio though, Bill.
Yeah, nothing wrong. Yeah, don't get me wrong. I've seen almost all of them, and they're great. So I'm lucky to say that. But yeah, anyway.
Can I go back a very long back? I'm sorry that my voice is not clear. And ask why the students hadn't read A Summer Birdcage.
I can't answer that. I'm sorry. I don't know. Just because undergraduate, it wasn't specific to that book, maybe. It was just that students hadn't done their homework. And
I'm sure that, well, that's the question that I want the answer to. Why hadn't they done their homework?
Is this is this why I hadn't read the book?
No.
Well, I don't know why other people hadn't read the book.
Is it because the overall amount of time available for reading is shrinking, or is being allowed to shrink, or are English departments capitulating to a pressure that they should be resisting? I mean, I can, I go back further than any of you. And summer reading, of course, was something examinable at the beginning of the autumn term. Why haven't you read The Fairy Queen? Why haven't you read Paradise Lost? Both were on your list to be read over the summer. A short exam, who was Britomart or whatever, was there to test that people had done the work. Now, it's all very well to say, well, I was busy with a summer job. I had to have a job in order to support myself. I didn't have the time to read. It's very hard to answer that question or that protest. But nevertheless, what is required of students has shrunk.
Okay.
There's been a number of questions also that would be quite nice to all. You might want to respond to. We've had like 4 different questions in addition to yours, so feel free to refer back. Also talk about how to be critical with the material, etc.
I sort of wanted to. I feel a bit chastened. 40 years on, or whatever. Sorry, but I wanted to come back to what Elizabeth said about there is a corner of English called textual bibliography, and okay, that's interesting. That is an interesting corrective here, but I think what has struck me about this discussion about materiality is the way that we've kind of moved all over the disciplinary map. And so Laura opened by confessing that she didn't do English and she was an art historian. Cynthia was talking about social history and Roger Chartier, etc. Bill then said that he did cultural history. And I just keep thinking, are we derailing your whole seminar series? At least 2 of us have said we're not making a case for English. But I just wonder, is what we're talking about English, or are we talking about English in some expanded sense, or are we talking about some sort of interdisciplinary work?
Yeah. Well, and I'd like to return to your challenge, Sarah, which I think is a really important one. Which is about how important it is to make the case for English as a monolith, or perhaps as it's seen from outside, or as a kind of sort of endangered creature that we then are able to see objectively as it's challenged or attacked as like not STEM, then that sort of shows up the contours, the boundaries of the discipline, as it were. But then, or is it fine to make this, multiplicity of cases for English as it sort of actually exists in all its different habitats? And I also want to pick up your challenge about the material, which thank you for also coming back to that, Claire. And I think, we do want to put the material back in, but also I suppose I see this kind of attack, this sort of neoliberal attack on, like the non-utilitarian, on beauty and literature, the value of literature inherently, and so on. So I suppose part of me wants to be able to make that case. The two things are not mutually exclusive, but it's like, how do we think materially while also retaining the value of the non, like financially material, when that's shrinking so fast? You're carefully making that distinction, perhaps out there, perhaps it's not made so clearly. But I don't know if there are other,
but isn't the point that it's shrinking in some institutions and it's growing massively in other institutions, and it's what you're talking about here in terms of English studies. It's about market share and competition a lot of the time. You're absolutely right, Eliane, that the kind of neoliberal attack doesn't address that whatsoever. And this is what I like about both the materiality of the book, but also the matter of English studies and its material conditions, because those are elided in that attack. And so we keep going back to the same point endlessly.
Exactly.
And that, that seems to me to be a real challenge to address that. And I'm kind of regularly copied into things about this.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about it from the other angle. But I would also say to Laura, Bill, you're in a very different situation, but art history is similarly challenged. So is history. Well, art history in schools is, Laura, it really is.
Yeah, but I would say that art history has been facing this challenge for a very long time, and it has a whole different set of drivers, which are to do with, in Britain in particular, to do with the fact that it's a 1920s, 30s discipline. Like, it's barely been going. It was founded to serve rich collectors, and it's never thrown that off. And it's done different things at different times that have some parallels with other disciplines, but I do think it's a really different case. I think history is a stronger parallel to draw. But I think in some ways, art history, it's my discipline, and I will stand up for it as a rigorous training. But I think it's a different kind of, I think you would make the case in a different way because you're starting from a really different place.
Yeah. I'll retract that one, Laura.
I would also say I think it was Warwick. I can't see you behind because you're entirely obscured by Eliane. But I think I started doing a little search to see how far back I could trace people saying, "Oh, students today don't do anything," and then much less. They're working much less hard than the generation before, and I think we can take it back a long way. And I think there are all sorts of pressures. There are absolutely the external pressures that you talk about in terms of having a job, but there's also I'm thinking of this slightly because I was reading a 1970s PhD a little while back, and I was struck by just how little there was to read. Actually, it was much easier to master a subject because there was a much less. You didn't have to learn all the different kinds of criticism and theory of the 1990s and the early 2000s because it didn't exist yet. So you were doing different things and your time was divided differently. But I don't think that Jill's cohort was necessarily working any less hard, although we've all had classes where the students have not done the reading and we have no idea why, and nobody wants to say, and you suspect it was the party. But there are always going to be a range of pressures. And also just, the growth of material. Cynthia will be relieved to know that I was reading an essay last night where I was thinking, oh, but this student hasn't cited this and hasn't cited that. And then I looked at the bibliography and thought, well, yes, because this student has read a load of things that were published in the last 5 years that I haven't read yet. No, staying on top of a literature is really, really hard. And this is one of the problems with multi or interdisciplinary work. It's that balancing the expertise that we expect to come with the individual discipline with the wider knowledge. And that's a really, really hard thing to do. I'll shut up.
Thanks. Forgive me, this isn't a question, but perhaps because materiality is the field in which I work to some extent, the value of studying the material for English studies in departments seems fairly clear to me, in the sense that there is a world in which the materiality of the digital is becoming a fairly significant question. So I think we're in some respects we've been avoiding talking about things like ChatGPT, but to give an example of a field in which this is an active issue, there's currently discussion amongst OpenAI, the institute that has created ChatGPT, to figure out ways to watermark their work in order to identify it as digitally produced by this robot. Watermarks are a fairly standard part of book materiality. They're something that have been used to indicate origin for a very long time. And I would hope that there's somebody at OpenAI who has an English degree and who has spent some time considering materiality, either as part of that or perhaps as a media studies degree, because a lot of what we're talking about here seems to me to have been studied for the last 50 years by what would be called media studies departments. They just tend to avoid books and deal with everything else because they seem to think that books are somehow left to English departments, and perhaps English departments have not sufficiently addressed the actual book aspect of media studies, as it were. But with that in mind, and maybe this is a suggestion for Sofnam, who was asking about how to teach book materiality. I'm part of a program which teaches, where doctoral students teach seven-hour-long classes to students at A-level school, disadvantaged A-level schools that don't have sufficient resources. And I'm putting together a course for these students on how to understand book materiality. And see, that sounds very similar to what you might have done, Sarah, at this reading group. But and I'm just going to be getting them to bring. These are students who do not really have access to that many books, and I don't actually know how they will be accessing whatever books they're being expected to read for English. But I'm simply going to have them bring the book that they're reading for English, and if they don't have a physical book, we'll find a way to provide one to them, and they will be examining that modern printed, presumably paperback, for signs of materiality and for signs of creation and signs of origin. So, and in that way, I think these students can be taught both without necessarily access to significant special collections, archives, or rare books as such. They can still begin to explore how information is being delivered to them, whilst at the same time analyzing that information in their English class. And I would hope that in some respects that form of media evaluation or media studies would give them the opportunity to be able to approach English as it is delivered to them in other forms, or whatever language as it is delivered to them in other forms, either via TikTok, Snapchat, ChatGPT, somebody's blog, a medieval manuscript, what have you.
I think that's a really useful intervention, because I mean, you don't have to look at the first folio or Beowulf to see signs of use, marginalia, or to understand the text as a material thing. Yeah, I mean, I suppose some of the material that I work with is quite. I don't know. I mean, like the definitely non-canonical. I mean, I'm talking about kind of. This is perhaps not exactly the kinds of things that you're talking about, but movable books, children's books, things that have kind of signs of use that then they're not kind of revered objects in an archive, but they do reveal reading and materiality in a way that is very teachable and very kind of it's easy to communicate and see in the kinds of ways that you're talking about. And also, yeah.
I was going to say, you also reminded me that one of the great things about the reading group that I ran in the prison is that we would buy copies of the books for the people in the group, and they could take the books away with them. They were theirs to keep, and they could have them in their cell. And sometimes you'd go back the next month and they would say, oh, I lent it to my friend, he really liked it, blah, blah, blah. So that is so valuable, and it contrasts with the experience of teaching in an undergraduate classroom where, in my mind, like you were saying, Cynthia, I still imagine that everyone is going to have a paperback copy of the book in front of them. Nobody has a paperback copy of the book, and they're on their phones, or, and it's, yeah.
I don't know if they're burning, we have to wrap up, but
no other comments in the chat yet, apart from one that I missed earlier, which was just a comment from Elizabeth, and it was relating back to something that Sarah had said about illustration, and she makes the point that illustration on covers and jackets is motivated quite differently from illustration proper, the form of being marketing. But just to throw that in. Sarah's pulling a face. But that's, otherwise we've not had anything else in the chat.
Cynthia or Will, do you have concluding?
No, I think we said it all.
I think we have. I think we have. But I just wanted to say, I think I don't think that we should forget either the thrill of some books.
That's a very cautious ending.
Well,
Go for it. All books.
But there's been, I don't know, fetishization is an issue, but sometimes I don't think we should flip that entirely. It has a value.
Mm-hmm.
It has a value. So there you go.
Amen.
That's
Yeah,
it.
absolutely. Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you to all our fantastic panelists and to you for your questions.